Hello, everyone. I am just wondering whether everyone can see me now. Maybe the technical team wants to confirm that we are live. Yes, we are live. It's confirmed. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our very last Studium lecture of the 2022-2023 Studium lecture series. My name is Olavo Basavose, and I am the coordinator of the Studium General Gent. It is my honor and pleasure to welcome you all to this very impromptu online lecture tonight. First of all, it's my understanding that many of you who bought tickets for the live event tonight were able to make it to the live stream, to the online alternative tonight, and I'm extremely grateful for your flexibility with us and for joining us at this very last minute online. Thank you so much. Before we get to tonight's inspiring lecture, and I first want to have a quick introduction of the Studium General Gent, a quick explanation of the future ecologies theme that we have had this whole year, and I want to make a proposal for the tone and mood of our gathering tonight. So for those of you who do not know, the Studium Generale Gent is a Hoog-Gent course and public program. Hoog-Gent in English, I think the proper translation of that is the University of Applied Sciences of Ghent, but I could be wrong. Anyway, so this is a course, but also a public program that invites its audience to discussions, to debate, and critical reflections on society, art, culture, and science. And today we're going to have a beautiful mixture of all those things all at once, but more later on. We do this by curating and hosting 10 lectures each year centered around a specific theme. The theme this year was and still is future ecologies. We came to this theme through consultations with my inspired colleagues at CUSC and Conservatorium, our many external partners and good friends of the Studium Gent. Future ecologies. Let me first begin with a quote of Malcolm Ferdinand's amazing book, Decolonial Ecology, which was translated this year in English. So please do get it. It's really inspiring and paradigm shifting. Anyways, he introduces us in his writing to the so-called Great Divide. He describes it, he summarizes it as, I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty speaking today. The dualistic opposition that separates nature and culture, environment and society, establishing a vertical scale of values that places man above nature. And this great divide, this dualistic opposition, is revealed through the technical, scientific, and economic modernizations of mastering nature, whose effects are measured in the extent of the pollution of the earth, the loss of biodiversity, the disruption of the climate, and in the measure of gender inequalities, social misery, and disposable lives that are engendered. Okay. Malcolm Ferdinand's Une écologie décoloniale inspired us at Studium Gent, and also the colonial calls for the rejection of this great divide, this separation from man and nature. It inspired us to seek out and explore future-orientated ways of thinking, propositions, and imaginings which presuppose the inextricable intertwining of humans with their environment and their non-human neighbors. Humans as part, but not masters and lords over ecological systems. In our explorations, in our search, we invited thinkers, doers, makers, and researchers to share with our audience, you tonight, their learned and creative visions of the future of the ecological systems that house us, that enable us, that threaten and or change our societies. For tonight, we have from cooking sections, we have Dani Fernández Pascual, who through cooking sessions that he founded with Alon, Schwabe, they examined the systems that organize the world through food, and using site-responsive installation, performance, and videos, cooking sections explores the overlapping boundaries between art, architecture, ecology, and geopolitics. What I said, science, art, culture, society, it's all happening tonight. Danny's and his partner Alon's and his whole team at the cooking sections their practice uses food as a lens and a tool to observe landscapes in transformation. They have worked on multiple iterations of the long-term site-responsive Climavore project since 2015, which explores how to eat as humans change climates. Their work has been exhibited at Tate Britain, Serpentine Galleries, Salt, Bonnier's Kunsthal, Grand Union, Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, I cannot pronounce that name. Storefront for Art and Architecture, the 58th Venice Biennale, the Istanbul Biennale, the Sharjah Art Biennale, Performa 17, Manifesta 12, and among many other things that they've done. They have been residents at the Headland Center for the Arts in California and the Politics of Food at Delphina Foundation in London. They lead a studio unit at the Royal College of Art in London and have been guest professors at the Academy of Fine Arts in Munich. Now, in 2021, they were nominated for the Turner Prize, and they were awarded the special prize at the 2019 Future Generation Art Prize, and were also nominated for the Visible Art for Socially Engaged Practices. Danny, who's with us tonight, is the recipient of the 2020 Harvard GSD Wheelwright Prize for his work called Being Shellfish. Okay, before we hear from Danny, I want to say a few words about the tone we strive for at all of our Studium lectures. Hold on, let me pull that up. Okay. We are cognizant that the topics that we addressed this year and also will tonight can and sometimes elicit intense thoughts and feelings, and we believe that a collective commitment to the intention of care can help us shape the tone, the nature, and perhaps even the beauty of our gathering this evening. We understand the intention of care to be multidimensional. There is the intention to be caring towards our speaker tonight, the intention to be caring towards each other, and the intention of to be caring towards yourselves. How can we be caring towards a speaker? At Studium, we think it's important to have you as our guests, as our audience, keep in mind that the speakers that we have invited are also just that, guests. They have been invited to speak and share their ideas, their research, and their ambitions for a better future. And we believe that, guests deserve hospitality, warm hospitality, a kind of hospitality that allows them to be vulnerable with us, that allows them to be vulnerable in their feelings, but in their thinking, vulnerable enough to make mistakes along tonight or along the way. But also that vulnerability that allows them to be courageous in the sense that they can choose what they want to talk about, that they can set boundaries, but also maybe not have all the answers, and maybe also that they can say, well, I don't know, what do you think, perhaps? So a kind of vulnerability that allows them to really connect with us tonight, as not only as sort of experts or something, or as sort of like representatives of certain ideas, but as human beings, as people who have been invited to share their ideas, and hopefully you can help us, grant us, or sort of make a hospitable space for them. Now, the intention of care also has a dimension of care for each other. And here at the Studium, We think of it as being full of care in how you address each other. You can address each other in the chat. You can address each other in the Q&A later on. That's one way of being full of care in how you address each other, but also in how you hear each other. And we think it's important to keep in mind that the Studium lectures are like they're above in all things, but basically they're pedagogical in nature. That's what is happening here. We're coming to learn, and it is sound pedagogical practice in a space of learning to respect each other's dignity as participants, to respect each other's dignity, to believe in each other's earnestness, to nurture each other's curiosity, and feed each other's desire to learn. I think by doing so, in how we hear each other and how we address each other, in doing so, we can be very caring. Last but not least, we encourage you all to practice care for yourselves. Pedagogical spaces require of us to practice a particular type of self-care in the form of introspection, especially when we find ourselves feeling uncomfortable or even in pain. We want to encourage you to not only sit with the discomfort, but to study it with open curiosity, to really kind of examine what worldview and a view of the self is endangered in this particular moment, or by this particular statement that this person has shared with us. How did you come to acquire this worldview, and is it really in danger? And you know, what does it mean to be for it to be endangered? In summary, we ask you to be full of care for our guests, for one another, and for yourselves. Thank you for being so patient and sitting with me through all that. Some of you have heard this many times, but I hope you still find it valuable enough to listen to it. Good. Now is the time for what you all came here for. In tonight's Studium lecture, Danny will talk to us about how to eat as humans as climates change, or actually how to live as humans in changing climates. And amidst an unfolding climate breakdown and stark warnings that humanity must drastically change its ways of living to halt carbon emissions and biodiversity loss, while supporting ethical labor and social structure, this lecture explores ways to tackle the legacies of industrialism and extractivism. It aims to move beyond a carnivore, omnivore, locavore, vegetarian, or vegan diet and think through Climavore as a future-defining way of eating, of living, of loving in a new epoch, decentering humans on this planet. Danny, you have obviously a very ambitious mission for tonight. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you,
And
yes.
welcome, welcome, welcome. Have fun. And I am very eager to hear your whole presentation and learn more about your work. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. Highly appreciated. So I'm Danny, and yeah, even if you see me here tonight, we have a big team. So as it was mentioned in the introduction, we set up cooking sections in London back 10 years ago. This is our 10th anniversary. And we also have grown in number of collaborators according to the different projects that we do in different geographies. So we have Rosa Whiteley and Remy Kufariji working with us in London, but also Danny Barrows, who's the director of care of the Climavore project that I'll be introducing in a minute. And also Shona Cameron, who's the director of the Climavore station in Skye and Rassay. And also Kelly Sidney, who is the in charge of becoming Climavore and all the collaboration with restaurants that I will also explain later. And also now new members of the team that I would like to introduce to the audience. We have Enrico Milazzo, an anthropologist, Merve Anil, and Kubilay Ergelek, who each one is in charge of different projects I will be presenting. So there's like a lot of minds are involved in making all this happen. And what I thought for tonight is to share some slides and take you through some of these work. Here we go. So I hope you see the slides. Let me know otherwise. And yeah, basically how the whole Climavore project came about with the different iterations. And as it was mentioned in the introduction, for us, it has been like a whole process of identifying how seasons are changing. It's clear that they are changing, but how do we identify or observe signs when that happens? And food, in that sense, is the way we use it as a tool to understand these landscapes in transformation. And the moments when the harvest happens or doesn't happen, or is delayed or happens earlier, are precisely these moments when the moments when traditional knowledge or citizen science or observations or all kinds of measuring devices also come together and sense these glitches in things that are no longer how they used to be. And phenomena range from the rice harvest to cherry blossom in some parts of the world, or the wine harvest, which is another kind of very kind of cyclical event that helps us see how these mismatches in weather and times of the year and the expected food that you would be able to get. And at the same time, these new observations, in a way, for us, are moments when we need to start thinking about other ways of seeing or living or loving in this planet, and how to sense all these moments of distress. This has been done in many, many ways. One of the classic examples is, for instance, different technological solutions to this changing of seasons, or in a way how industrialist production of tomatoes, in this case, rely many times on ethylene, which is a gas that helps them ripen artificially in chambers underground, not only tomatoes, but many other fruits. And in a way, for us, what is something that we've been thinking a lot about is how these disruption of the seasons leads to alterations in the harvest, which then the industry, or especially extractivist industries, tackle by bringing even more solutions, technical solutions, to fix those problems that they already created, right? So it's almost like a vicious cycle of problem solution that in a way exacerbates the whole crisis. And these acceleration of processes in industrial food production are very clear, for instance, in greenhouses with the light systems that they have, or in battery chicken farms that use artificial light to speed up the growth, or in salmon farms, as I'll be speaking in a minute, with, again, in some of these light systems that fake the seasons in order to have continuous food production. So mimicking summer sunshine and having like 2 summers and no winter every year. And all these disruptions, in a way, following Hannah Landecker, who is a historian of science that we've been in conversation with for some time. And she talks about how all these disruptions, in a way, enter our metabolism, right? How all these ways in which chemicals and pollutants, and that are many times also added to pesticides or even animal feed, how they enter also the human metabolism. But also, as she claims, that for us is very evocative, is how there's such an amount of chemical compounds circulating around us that actually the proportion has changed. And it is rather us as bodies who are circulating through chemicals and not the other way around. And that kind of realization of how our metabolism is completely porous and there is no real inside or outside anymore, because we have toxins circulating through our pores, our skin, even penetrating our DNA, and they are here to stay for a long time. So how also we, like, the climate emergency is not something that we perceive or observe, but it's actually deeply ingrained in our own bodies, also non-human bodies. So that's how we started Climavore as a platform and a network and a movement, as a way to get people together and think about alternatives. First, to understand the new seasons of the climate crisis, like a season of polluted shores or movement of deserts or soil exhaustion or drought, but then also how do we tackle these extractivist forms of food production from a local level. So on the one hand, tackling the source of the problem, but also thinking of transitions into other horizons. And tonight, what we were thinking is to present 4 seasons, these new seasons of the climate emergency, as we want to refer to them, which are going to be a season of drought, a season of movement of deserts, a season of wetland draining, and a season of polluted oceans by fish farms. The first season, a season of drought, and again, like maybe to mention that for us is important to think of these seasons as periods that might repeat or not, but are kind of periods that in a way could inform much more what's happening or what could happen around us if we were considering them as seasons instead of the traditional winter, summer, autumn, spring in certain latitudes, or the rainy and dry season in other latitudes. So this project came about by invitation of Manifesta, which is a biennial of contemporary art that happens every 2 years in a different city. And in this edition happened in Palermo in Sicily, south of Italy, where we were looking at questions around drought and how irrigation and water has been deeply ingrained into the control of both humans, but also landscapes. And we started looking at these incredible typologies of single tree gardens from the island of Pantelleria, which is a bit off the coast of Sicily, where these ancient or like several 100-year-old structures in a way were invented to protect the most precious source of vitamins, which were oranges or lemons, because people realized they needed them to avoid getting scurvy. So to do that, they would put a lot of like human resources and economic resources on building this single, this like drywall stone around a single tree to create a microclimate. And even in the absence of water on the island, they would water the trees without water by creating condensation on the stones. And you can even see mosses growing around. This is the different typologies of these giardini panteschi, which sometimes are octagonal, polygonal, circular, and so on. And this connects to the whole history of citrus and irrigation in Sicily, which precisely because of the boom in the fruit to tackle scurvy, and was easy to transport worldwide as well, that led also to the emergence of organized crime structures like the mafia. So there was always this tension between kind of having access to water for irrigation, but also not being dependent on the mafia or organized crime. So then there has been this attempt to bypass those structures by thinking of how not to water with water, or how to create other microclimates or strategies or tactics to emancipate trees and people from water. In many places around the world, there's like incredible inventions on how to create those microclimates, or how to create humidity or keeping moisture on the ground. But also, and after speaking to different farmers for this project in Italy, it became clear that some regions, especially in the south, where people have been living with drought for decades or centuries, also people know how to adapt, and even the seeds and the crops adapted also together with the cultivation of them. So there was a certain symbiosis or resilience, if you want, on how to live with drought. Whereas in other parts of Italy, for instance, in the north, when the Po River Valley was kind of completely dry in the summer, then the panic emerges because there is no such knowledge, or that knowledge has been erased or displaced. So what we did for Manifesta was working with agronomists and botanists in the city, the University of Palermo, to first look into this history of microclimates in the area, in the region, but then also make contemporary versions of these structures with conventional materials around citrus trees in the city of Palermo. So here you can see one of these installations, microclimates, that watered the trees without water, or reduced the water stress in the trees with very conventional construction materials, just turned sideways. Or another one we made with these nets in the center of the city around 8 orange trees to reduce the sunlight and create shading. Or this one that was, we made it with these tubes that we found on site, which was in a villa that belonged to a mafioso, like one of the leaders of the organized crime, that was confiscated by the government and open to the public as a common good. So we used one of the trees there, a mandarin tree, and the tubes that were lying around to again create this kind of version of the Giardino Pantesco. And for us, this was the performance of the trees. So it wasn't us humans who were doing something, but we wanted to read it as these structures that were monitoring the performance of the trees inside and outside these enclosures to understand temperature, light, humidity, and so on. In parallel, also we worked with local restaurants, like a pizzeria, in an ice cream place, or different shops, to create a drought picnic box that we call the secco al sacco, which was like a takeaway meal made with drought ingredients instead of heavily irrigated vegetables that once were very common on the island in Sicily, but have been a bit forgotten. So how to rescue some of these ancient knowledge or varieties to also support, on the one hand, the farming of it, but also helping people to kind of reimagine that landscape. So people could go to these different places, get their secco al sacco, and then go to the nearby installations to enjoy it in these microclimates. So that was the first season. The second season I would like to introduce tonight, and it happens to be 4 seasons, but it's not that we think of them as 4. There are like many more, but tonight I'll be presenting 4, which is the season of movement of deserts, which was that we started by invitation of the Sharjah Architecture Triennial, looking into these microclimates, but within a much more desert environment. And the desert, again, has been problematized, especially by Global North or the West, in terms of creating a problem. So people have been living with the desert for generations, but it was especially after Second World War, when there was a whole war against the desert and desertification as a problem. Many times because of aridity conditions were increased by deforestation of settler colonial projects or imperial economic ventures to take timber out of many places. So yes, there's always been deserts, but also many other places were desertified by different European powers. And hence the whole issue of putting actually people as the perpetrators of a crime, desertification, that they were actually the victims of. But that victimization in a way was created by the extraction of resources from phosphates to timber and many others. So we were looking at different typologies of how people have been living in the region around the United Arab Emirates or the Arabian Peninsula, but also like northern parts of Africa, creating very incredible typologies of life and cultivation within these desert environments, but also looking at ethnobotany and different plants, edible remedies that are still in place, but somehow disappearing because of the negation of these environments. If you go to places like Dubai, Sharjah, there's these kind of belief in the vegetation that doesn't necessarily match that geography, which is heavily irrigated lawns or petunias or other more kind of English landscaping vegetation. And for us, it was interesting after talking to many people, kind of this disconnection between desert flora and the plants that are allowed to live in the city. And so we started conversations with different researchers that have been looking into how plants collectively communicate with each other to make the most out of the moisture in the ground, and how they create these patterns to tell each other where to grow and not to grow when there is water stress. And obviously also the whole like many sources that different local botanists and agronomists were pointing out to bring back these desert plants into the city, because at the moment, if you go, we were going to almost every nursery around, none of these plants are necessarily sold commercially because they are not considered ornamentals. And for us, that kind of tag of being ornamental or not ornamental was interesting, when like the only ornamentals in a way were the ones that created that lush imaginary of the English landscape in most cases, to the point that when we wanted to create these 9 microclimates that you see here from above it was a construction site of a modernist building from the 60s, 70s, we again followed these principles that I was talking about before from Sicily, but also other parts in the desert, where you dig these depressions and create another like microclimate to water without water or to water with the stones. And those methods, also talking to the agronomists there, it was like, how do we plant them? And we wanted all these desert plants, but then it was impossible to source them because they are not ornamentals, even if they are from right there. So no nursery were distributing them, to the point that we had to create a team to go and collect seeds from the desert outside the city, to propagate them in the city, and like set up a small nursery ourselves, and then be able to actually plant them. And these were also plants that were either fruits, desert fruits, or plants that are succulents that you can eat, or other uses, medicinal or aromatic. So this was our desert food garden that now we are in its 3rd year, and it's now like quite overgrown. And this, again, we put sensors to monitor the performance of the trees inside and outside these microclimates. And last time we visited, it was interesting how now it's completely taken over by butterflies and insects and birds, where before there was nothing. The kind of topography, in a way, itself is built with a lot of the rubble from a nearby demolition site, and also some bricks that we produced with waste from another demolition site in the city. Now, the 3rd season I'd like to talk about is the season of wetland draining. And this is another geography which takes us to Istanbul in Turkey, which is the land of the water buffalo. And it started by looking at these infrastructural project that you see here on your left. So this is then kind of a render of how it could be in the future. Here you see the Bosphorus Canal, and here on the left is the proposed Canal Istanbul, which is a new shipping canal. I don't know if you're familiar with the geography, Istanbul city is here, the city center, and this canal is projected to be 4 times larger than Panama Canal. And for us, that was quite a considerable piece of infrastructure that would also have tremendous effects on the water ecology, but also the wetlands that is cutting across here outside the city. And these wetlands have been an incredible habitat for herders and water buffalo that have to be continuously roaming in the landscape. So they are like, as contrary to cows, water buffaloes are semi-wild, so they are not fully domesticated, and they need all this kind of land to roam around. And they have been supplying buffalo milk to the city for centuries, and this has led to the creation of very important kind of dishes in Turkish cuisine since the Ottoman time, and like sütlaç or kaymak or muhallebi. And for us, the whole project was, how do we think of a cultural celebration of the water buffalo to prevent these incredible biodiversity spots from disappearing, but also supporting the herders that are being more and more encroached by different pieces of infrastructure. So we started by doing many things. One of them was a series of metabolic studies, we call them, so to understand the relationships between different species through metabolism, or through how different parts of the diet of these companion species rely on each other. So from birds, depending on the parasites of water buffaloes, to frogs that use them to travel, to grasses that depend on the saliva of the buffalo when they graze to fertilize the soil, and many more. And these also, so here you see some of the wetlands and the landscape for you to have a sense. This was a collaboration with artist Serkan Taycan from Turkey, also that he's been working on these routes and how to walk along the projected path of the Istanbul Canal has been very contested. But also here, Akgün İlhan, she made a water survey looking at the water bodies that the construction of the new airport had made disappear, which are all these lakes and ponds. Some of them are natural, others come from post-industrial sites where peat and coal was dug, and then when those activities were abandoned in the mid-20th century, they flooded and many of them became wallows for the buffalo to swim on. So another part of the project what we did was to actually open one of these buffalo milk dessert shops, which are called muhallebici, like a contemporary version where these desserts would be served. As far as we know from the research, we have only managed to find 3 shops left in the whole city of Istanbul that still use the buffalo milk from the wetlands around the city. And they were also, one of them was actually making and supplying the kaymak, yogurt, muhallebi, and sütlaç that we were serving in the space. So it was kind of an installation, but it was a shop in a way of sorts, or people couldn't tell perhaps the difference. And there we were serving these dishes, but also featuring the different metabolic studies that we commissioned. One of the important parts were these 1,000 pots that we commissioned to Başak, who is a potter and archaeologist, and she made 1,000 clay pots out of a wallow, a new pond that we dug for the buffaloes, and these where we were serving all the things. Then we had Melissa Ball, who is an ornithologist, and she was looking at these relationships between the buffaloes and the birds throughout the whole year at different times. And that was with this 3D film animation. Then we worked with Burçin, who is an botanist, and he was collecting all the different plants from the meadows that the buffaloes depend on, and the other way around. So those were also pressed and shown on the tables in the space. And also we worked with Anadolu Meralari, who is a group who's looking into making the grazing more efficient when you have limited amount of land, which is what's happening. So how to make the most out of the least space possible, given the circumstances around you. And also worked with Mustafa Afce, who is an ethnomusicologist, and we asked him to research the history of songs talking about buffaloes in Anatolian languages, so which are like Turkish, Kurdish, Bulgarian, Armenian, and Greek. So he found all these songs where buffalo were the protagonists, and then we wrote the lyrics in the corresponding languages on these mirrors on this space. And the most important part of the project was that we wanted also to celebrate the buffaloes, but where the buffaloes and the herders live. So this, which is the villages in the surroundings, the outskirts of Istanbul. And there we launched the first water buffalo festival, Manda Festivali, where we worked with the villagers and herders and their families to create a new festival. So last year was the first edition, and there were around 600 people. It was very fun. And now we've managed to secure the continuation of the festival. So it will happen now every September, and we have it confirmed for at least the next 3 years. So if you want to join, it will happen this mid-September in Istanbul, in the villages around Istanbul. And also we commissioned Gülünler, which is an indie music band from Istanbul, to write a new song to the Manda, to the buffalo, and you see her here performing the premiere. Here you can see. And then the fourth season that I'll be presenting today is a season of dead zones, which connects to pollution from fish farms. And this started in Skye in Scotland, which is an island, northwest of Scotland. And there we heard from two activists about this little bird, this is sparrow, that had turned pink, and the feathers, in a way, had turned salmon. And that event was very shocking. Like, we couldn't believe it, but then it was captured in the BBC, the footage you see here. And then we started trying to track all these different phenomena whereby artificial color is flowing through all these different bodies, and why and how. So this is a SalmonFan, which is the tool that the salmon industry uses to add artificial pigment to your salmon so that it matches consumer expectations, because otherwise salmon in farms would be white gray. And this is the way they add it, and they can check how much colorant has the fish taken into its body, and also according to the color is easier to market in some places than others. So some places like Canada or Japan might like salmon in tone 32, whereas maybe Northern Europe 27, 28 is okay to market, and for sure like salmon lower than 21 in the scale won't be very easy to sell. And this is what you get, these fish with artificial coloring in the supermarket. So what we did, the first move, in a way, we've been working on this since 2016 by invitation of Atlas Arts, and slowly that has become, like, the project in Skye and Raasay has become its own kind of organization and programming. And we've done a lot of work on the colors of the Anthropocene, right? How all these different species, from salmon to pigs to chicken to birds, are either being dyed in different colors to supplement the deficiencies of extractivism, because salmon in farms would not get access to that color, or also animals that are changing color to signal environmental stress or distress. So this was an installation we did at Tate Britain, which was called Salmon and Red Herring, showing and tracing all these different journeys in color, also through an audio narration, like a cyclorama. The problem with salmon farms, I don't know how familiar you are with them, is the pollution, that amongst many other things, but basically these cylinders in the sea, which are open nets where the excrement and the antibiotics and everything billows out into the water and just is diluted or washed away. But that creates a lot of problems, even if you can't see them from above. This is one of these circles where the fish, 100 to 200,000 fish are contained in these enclosures. And then there is an automated feeder that gives them feed pellets. But as with any industry at that scale, parasites appear when you have them growing so close to each other. And there's these sea lice that eat them alive, basically. So we have many stories about salmon farms. But what we've been working on since that commission was to think of alternative aquacultures for the island in a season of polluted oceans by fish farms. So on the one hand, tackling the source, but also thinking of new horizons. And this was a structure we built on the intertidal zone of the island in Skye as a public forum. At high tide, it's covered in water. You see it here from above, and it's mussels, seaweeds, and oysters filter the water as they grow. And at low tide, we use it as a platform for humans to have these discussions and workshops on how to transition into alternative aquacultures for the island. And this is nothing new. These ingredients like seaweeds, oysters, mussels, clams have been there and have been part of the collective usership of the coast for generations. They might have just been a bit forgotten from the diet. But yeah, from these seaweeds have been collected for fertilizer or as an edible ingredient in different parts of the coast in the UK. And also oysters, here you see these like many species all over the world, but these are from the British Isles. And here you can see like a tank with and without oysters. You might know how they oxygenate the water. So as part, in parallel, also we've been working with local schools to set up cooking apprenticeships to train the next generations of cooks on the island. And then we secured paid apprenticeships in partner restaurants that have removed salmon from their menus and introduced Climavore dishes instead, made with these ingredients that contribute to oxygenate the water. Also, we've been working with marine biologists to set up alternative prototypes of seaweed and oyster and mussel farms, but growing them as an ecology together, as a polyculture, instead of a single species in an intensive way. So the model is almost like a sea allotment, if you want, that is accessible on food, and that is a model that we are testing with different community trusts as something that would be also run and led by them. And then the last part is the whole material process that we've been developing in collaboration again with the restaurants of the island, where we've been collecting their waste seashells like scallops, oysters, mussels, then cleaning them and then developing new materials that do not need cement or resins. I guess you know cement is one of the most polluting materials in the world, but it's also very used in construction all over, and is also contributing a lot to CO2 emissions. So we've been developing these prototypes trying to replace the amount of cement or aggregates or resins in this process. In different tests, here was for the Los Angeles Public Art Triennial, where we worked there with waste shells. This was for another project in Taiwan for the Taipei Biennial, where we worked with local fabricators to develop a new contemporary version of this old Taiwanese technique to make these mortar cement with literally cooking shells, oyster shells, rice and sugar, but making a version that would work today. And then in Skye and Raasay, where we've been working with the restaurants, as I was saying, crushing, sorting, and then making this new tile that is almost 100% shells. And this was a new installation we presented last year in the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh, which was this piece with more than 400 tiles in different shapes that eliminates cement from the equation or resin. And for us, it's also important to think of the social aspect of these ingredients. And that's why we launched Becoming Climavore, which is a kind of a global campaign to replace some of these ingredients in cultural institutions, in universities, in canteens, to join and start the process of becoming Climavore. And for us, the restaurants or these spaces of collective eating are very important. And we like to go back to the origins of the word restaurant, which comes from bouillon restaurant in 18th century Paris, which were places where people could get soup to warm up the body. And it was almost like a medicinal remedy, a restaurant. It was the name to refer to the soup. And that name is stuck also to refer to the space, the collective space of dining. And we like to see the restaurants or the canteens or collective kitchens as places to not only restore the human body, but also restore ecology at large. And this is why also in the different museums, in exhibitions that we work, we've also started asking them to change the menus and become Climavore, how to adapt to these different seasons by changing their food offerings that many times are very disconnected from the curatorial program. And the first one, apart from the restaurants in Skye and Raasay, was Tate that removed farmed salmon from the 4 museums that they have. And later on, other museums across the UK joined, and also now other universities or spaces outside the UK that we are working with. So yeah, for us, in a way, these multiple approaches are very important because it's very hard to think of, what is the transition from salmon farming that is creating all these dead zones along the coast to alternative aquacultures. And to do that involves many forms of expertise. And obviously we don't have all of them in the team. And that's why we collaborate with fabricators, with marine biologists, with residents, with fisher folk, to think of all these tools through culture, education, or materials to shift into new horizons. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I think I should say thank you, Danny. That is a very generous offering that you are providing us here. Wow, it's a lot. I mean, obviously, in preparation for the invitation to come and speak at Studium last year already, we were advised by our colleagues in at COSC who were really excited to have cooking sections and Climavore coming to Studium. Like multiple people told me, like, you need to try to get Climavore to come. So I got a chance to kind of look through the many things your team and your community, really, I want to call them, works on. And I know you have just selected a small sample of the many things you do. But so I want to thank you for guiding us through these different seasons and the kind of interventions that you and the others, Alon and everybody else, works on. Before we continue with our conversation that I'm very excited about, I wanted to talk to our audience a little bit, and that gives you perhaps a little bit of time to, Danny, to rest a little bit. It's long talking for 30 to 40 minutes. It's long. It's really, really long, especially in this context where you don't have a lot of feedback from an audience. It can be very draining. So take a moment, maybe turn off your camera, get a glass of water. I don't know, something. Just okay. Dear audience, welcome, welcome, welcome. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I have. We're gonna have a conversation now with Danny, who's gonna do their best to talk to us about the many different things that his team and his community work on. We're used to having like a 30-minute conversations between me and the guests, and then we have 15 minutes Q&A. But given this particular live stream online sort of setup, we have found that it's a lot more easier to like sort of engage if it's a little bit shorter, like instead of like 45 minutes, if we kind of condense it down a little bit. So my suggestion to you as an audience is that we don't really keep to the strict like 30 minutes Q&A, 30 minutes conversation between me and Danny, and then 15 minutes Q&A. I suggest that in the next 30 minutes, we try to like sort of do it all together, right? What you can do is you can type your questions or comments, observations, reflections. It doesn't all have to be questions, right? Like, I think for some people it can be really daunting to contribute if they have to ask it as a question. How about y'all contribute just what you got, what you feel, what you're thinking, what resonates, what you agree with, what you don't agree with in the chat function. Obviously, you know, Danny, me, I will communicate this information, your questions and because there's a bit of we don't see directly your questions, right? So there's a bit of a in between. Helena from Studium is setting us the questions and the comments and observations in our little Zoom call here. Again, there's a bit of an overlap. There's a bit of a time lap in between, but I just want you to sort of embrace that space, to sort of share your thoughts, share your questions, share your observations, your aspirations, your insights freely. We could reflect on it, we could respond to it, or maybe we could just listen to you and, you know, sort of like share that and just sit with that observation and insight, we don't have to respond, right, Danny? Like there's no obligation to respond to everything, but I do think that it can be really nice if we kind of try to set the threshold very low. And in my experience, it's also a little bit easier to ask questions if it's online than if it's in this big auditorium where we normally do our lectures that, Danny, you don't get to see, but no, it's very big and it can be quite intimidating to like ask for the mic to come and then to speak out in front of everybody. That's a bit of a lower threshold here now that it's online, and you don't have to you don't have to deal with the whole audience, the whole space listening to you talk. But it also kind of creates certain dangers because it's a bit disembodied, right? So it's a little bit easier to adopt a non-caring attitude when it's online. I think we all know this, right? We've all seen how social media and sort of digital interactions can become a little bit less caring than we want to. So that's why I want to remind you of the intentions we started off with, right? Let's be caring in how we address each other and how we hear each other. Okay. How are you feeling, Danny? Are you energized? Are you ready to go at it again?
Yes, I'm ready. Yes.
Well, again, I want to thank you. I think that I just sort of like immediately from the get-go, it's very clear that your artistic practice is one which feels very different than the kind of artistic practice that we think in the mainstream, in the dominant sort of like what we think of artistic practice as like this brilliant individual sitting in an atelier by themselves and coming up with some sort of like brilliant, discrete object or intervention. But I feel like there are so many people and so many, like, do you even have a studio? Like, how do you do all these things? I mean, apparently you went and created wallows in East Istanbul. Like, that seems like a very sort of like non I just feels like you're leaving so much space for chaos, for, you know, like you've got this assignment, let's go to Italy, and then you develop this entire project that feels very like there's a lot of people involved, a lot of things that could go wrong, I just want to kind of like perhaps talk about that artistic practice, what it means to have so much and so many people and so many perspectives going on. How do y'all manage all that?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. Things go wrong in all this process, and maybe they have to go wrong because, like, those glitches, I think, help us also rethink stuff. And obviously, well, like anyone doing projects, right? There's always unexpected situations. I think for us, what is very important is to do all these projects, which are always by invitation of a small organization, a big museum, doesn't matter. Like there's someone there that is kind of hosting you and wants you to do a project. And maybe we've been very lucky with that, even if they were very small organizations, or museums or different groups. But I think for us, it has always been important that there is that kind of like platform on the ground, because we lack the knowledge, we lack the information about the local context. And even if we read and we try to speak to many people throughout the process, for us it's very important to rework the timelines. And that's also now what more and more we are very insisting. And like, when people want to work with us, it's like, how do we work beyond the duration of an exhibition or of a biennial? One, because we put a lot of effort in understanding the context, but also establishing new human connections that you cannot just then disappear after the end of the exhibition or the biennial. So and along that process, you get more and more people involved. And the question is how to also build on the existing struggles or the existing work that people are doing on the ground to try to use these different museums or organizations in the cultural sector to amplify their work.
Yeah, because that's a thing that just about that particular thing about people coming in a context where work is like resistance is already happening and so on. Like I have found as a anti-racist activist myself, I have found it really interesting how sometimes cultural institutions abroad are more likely to invite me to come and speak or do projects than engage local activists. And that's always been a really interesting sort of, and yeah, so I don't know, I can definitely resonate with that experience.
And it's a tricky one because many times I don't want to believe that they don't invite local people to do projects because they don't want to. But I also, some cases is to bring other ideas that can also push people into new ideas locally. I don't know, case by case. There's like, all kinds of situations, as you probably know. But for us is, again, even if you kind of appear in this new context, how do you build on the base that is already there and use it, right? So with many times we work with botanists and agronomists that no art institution would necessarily invite, but then it's like, okay, how do we use part of the production budget also to support experiments that they're already doing and that they can use as a test themselves, so that people in a way enter the conversation. And there are mistakes along the way, but that's what we try to do because we simply don't have the knowledge or the resources, and we find it much more fun and exciting to work with people there.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I felt like kind of going through, so not only this presentation, but also like learning about your work, I was quite impressed by the level of expertise involved. And I kept thinking, how do these people have so many degrees? Like you must be architects indeed, bioengineers, biologists, and so on. So you already kind of mentioned about having botanists and so on, and I'm kind of interested about sort of about that, like how has multidisciplinarity, but such advanced level of multidisciplinarity, how does that all sort of coalesce? How does that all work?
Yes. We definitely don't have all those skills in house. I wish. I think for us is how, because we don't specialize in making one kind of thing in the studio. I don't think that's the practice that we have, but rather when we respond to a certain context, and then it's like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we make a Buffalo Festival to try to shake a bit the legal situation of the permanence of the wetland? And then we've never made a Buffalo Festival before, but then you go and find, okay, music, like let's find an ethnomusicologist. Oh, water. I don't know anything about water, but like, let's talk to someone that knows about water. And if that person doesn't know, they'll point us to someone else. And slowly you build these, groups of people and try to work with that and see is an experiment and see what comes out.
Do you feel like working like that sort of, what does that do once, like, I feel like maybe there's no such thing as one of your projects being done. Maybe I need to rethink the question, but like, what happens when the assignment is finished, I guess? Like, having worked with so many people, what happens to these people that have worked with you and perhaps possibly met, and I don't know, like what happens after Climavore is gone, or does Climavore ever leave? I don't know.
We try to, well, it's always a matter of resources. So because these exhibitions and biennials and museums, well, everyone knows there's a limited amount of budget. But what we do is try to find, and we apply a lot for grants and try to find partners or figuring out how we could continue the project. In some cases, it's easy, or not easy, but it's less difficult than others. If there's certain foundations, organizations, or public grants that you can access. And in an ideal world, that's why we like to work, is to set up these teams locally that also they can run the project without us being the face of it, as in Alon and me. And for instance, in Skye, we've been working very hard to have Shona there, like leading the project. And yeah, and then slowly transition that now also how to bring even more, like for instance, these community groups to run some of the programs. And that will take us some years, but that's kind of the next phase for us. In other contexts, it's very hard because also like even within the institutions, people change and leave, come and go. And you need, without the host partner there, it's very hard to advance the project. In other cases, like people are just no longer interested, right? It's like, oh, yeah, great, we did this experiment. It took us somewhere, but not as expected, and everyone's happy to finish it. So yeah, you have different situations. In other cases, for us, is we offer it like, well, maybe we don't have any more resources to continue, but the work is there. If you want to use it or to expand it or to figure it out, it's also fine.
Yeah.
So yeah, case by case scenario, and there's like many different scenarios.
Okay, but I was kind of hoping to tell our audiences, if any people are like, oh, let's invite Climavore to do something, that they, like if they do so, that they know that Climavore won't leave, so it's like it's a lifelong commitment.
We'll try.
One of the things that I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit more about was this notion of metabolizing the climate breakdown. I think it's really interesting in the sense that, like, there is this thing that's happening with both sort of mammals, but also plant life in reaction to the climate getting warmer. Like, just generally speaking, around the globe, things getting warmer. There is like this thing that's happening with our metabolisms, including that of plants, where scientists are actually really kind of at the moment a bit perplexed at like, in a warmer world, what happens when, like, how well does plants photosynthesize, for example. We know, for example, in human bodies that warmer climates have pretty, like, seems to have scary effects and impacts on how well we metabolize, how well our metabolisms work. And in plant life, it's deep in research right now. Like, what is happening to plants? Will they still be able to digest and metabolize carbon as well as they have done so for millennia and eons? And I just thought it was really interesting that you were talking about metabolism as I don't know, as something perhaps that tells us something about interconnection, right? While I feel like metabolism itself might be in danger. Does that make sense with how I saw that, suddenly linked that, where I was like, oh, but wait a minute. What is that? How do we understand our interconnection through metabolism when metabolism itself is really right now in danger?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I hadn't thought about it that way, but definitely yes, it is something that can open a different path. I think for us, what we've been learning a lot about with metabolism comes mainly from Hannah Landecker. That if people don't know her, like, you should check her out. There's also online lectures, and she's, for us, like, it's been one of the incredible voices to read and talk to about thinking about these post-industrial systems and metabolism, and how, like, that kind of post-industrial condition is shaping that metabolism. So it's not necessarily that it's not working anymore, it's just working differently, if I understand correctly your point. And just to realize that, for instance, that with pathologies like obesity, right, that in some groups of the population are deeply embedded and they are almost transmitted over generations. And now there's more studies that are beginning to understand that actually it enters into the whole realm of epigenetics, right? So how is not only the climate change that is engraved in us, but also neoliberal practices or precarious housing conditions, right? That leads to certain diets that then lead to certain pathologies that then those are transmitted also to the future generations. So even that for us was a big shift to understand that all these things are connected. That it's not just, oh, that person is eating this or that, but the whole context around you, especially within a neoliberal precarious world, like night shift workers, for instance, right? Like how the fact that you don't know your schedule of work and you some days is day, some days night, sometimes evening, sometimes morning, that completely stresses your gut, and then you develop some of these pathologies, right? So it's not that you are not sleeping well or not you're not eating well. It's just like the 0-hour contract world is like engraving that into your body, right? So we cannot separate that climate crisis from neoliberalism at the end of the day. And to read that through metabolism, I think that was kind of for me one of the main lessons from Hannah. Yeah. How do you do what you do afterwards? That I don't know, but first to understand that these things are connected.
Yeah, I think for me, like the first time I came across this notion of social metabolism and societal metabolism was mostly in the degrowth literature, the economic degrowth literature, and that was really interesting to look at the ways in which to think through the ways in which this relationship to nature, to resources as such. It's sort of the ways people have been able to sort of calculate and think through, like what is the steady state, what is the equilibrium state that we can reach, perhaps in the way we consume and metabolize natural resources, including each other, right? So natural resources, also labor, for example, what you were just talking about. And for me, like I think that where I find a little bit tricky with the degrowth branch that really sort of focuses on this social metabolism is, I think that some of the questions that we have, I don't know, but like I feel sometimes that some of the questions and the issues we have about our relationship to the world and to nature, maybe we need to stop thinking of it in this consumptive sort of, like, as much as I can appreciate the effort to calculate and to figure out and to sort of prove that our metabolic system right now, societal, is gonna run out, like it's gonna, and also pollution coming out and everything. The fact that degrowth is able to contextualize in that way, but at the same time, I don't know, like I'm trying to find maybe some other ways of thinking about connection. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm afraid that metabolism might reiterate this consumptive relationship. Which it doesn't have to be, obviously, but it could be. Just
No, it could be. No, it's the point, because in a way it relies on consumption of like nutrients or matter in the body, without perhaps thinking about relationships that happen without digesting.
Yeah. And what I think is really cool about how you situate relationships with people and nature, you obviously also are interested in the histories. I think that's really cool and very interesting. But also you're interested in creating like these interventions, like you show us what things look like before and what things look like afterwards, right? Like, like I think that's really powerful. Saying that we can intervene, we can contribute in a way that is, I believe, regenerative, right? Is that what you're going for?
Potentially, yeah. In terms of like regeneration of the habitats, you mean?
Yeah.
Or potentially, yes. But again, like we struggle a lot with these terms because they've been now so co-opted for the opposite purposes that like we argue a lot about, like, so which term are we using today? Because like now this company is using this, now that corporation is doing that. We know sustainability is gone, like, but it's now
we lost it. It's gone.
Yes,
it's gone.
Yes. But then, like, regenerative, is it already co-opted or not enough? agroecology, how much are some of the evil kind of companies already using that or not? You know, there's this whole lexicon of greenwashing that Crane published, I think, some months ago. That is highly recommended.
What is it called? Lexicon of greenwashing?
Greenwashing. I can't remember the exact title, but greenwashing lexicon.
That is brilliant. I need that.
Let me check it. An agribusiness greenwashing glossary.
Okay, agribusiness greenwashing glossary.
Yes.
Brilliant.
And is all these terms. Well, the obvious one is sustainability, but yeah, long gone. But then from nature-based solutions, net zero, carbon offsets, zero deforestation. Yeah, you can check it out. And then what terms do you use? Like, and that's why also many times we just opt for like inventing one, because then like maybe there's less risk, even so, that it becomes used for the opposite purposes.
We have a few questions already in the thing. I want to mention them. Thibaut is asking in Dutch. I have to translate this really quickly. Is this basically seasonal eating? I don't know if you know this concept in I think in the Netherlands and in Belgium. I see this a lot. This notion that we need to eat produce of the seasons.
Yes, yeah.
So like don't eat strawberries in I don't know, in the winter.
Yeah.
Even though they're available, but like to sort of like as a climate, as sort of reducing climate impact is by eating seasonally. The question that Thibaut is asking, is this basically what you're proposing?
It's a good point, but also we are quite careful with this eating seasonally, and I think a lot of food movements did incredible work in pushing this forward because of the industry and how they have disrupted the seasons. But at the same time, because of all these infrastructural problems and things that are really embedded in policy, food policy, then who can afford to eat seasonally, even if the seasons are kind of working in some places? And that's the problem, that like many of the farming subsidies are geared towards very extractive industrialist forms of food production. And then farmers that are trying to grow a small scale without pesticides, and society is demanding from them to take care of nature, then they have to charge a certain price that people cannot afford. So for me, more than eating seasonally, one of the questions that we ask ourselves is why is not every supermarket selling things that are not toxic? Why do you need to pay triple price not to be poisoned? Which is an issue of like public health, but it's not being addressed because industrialist lobbies are pushing for these forms of pollution for it not to be stopped. Yeah. So it's a matter of choice at the end of the day, like who has the capacity to choose. And also in our own work, when we propose these other seasons, like some people might be able to afford it, but other people might not even have access to buy a fresh tomato within walking distance.
That's a very powerful insight, I have to say. I think indeed, insofar as the seasons will remain, it is a good question. Who can afford to eat seasonally? Very good question. Another question that we got is, and I think you must get this one. It's a bit related with what you just the answer you just gave, but still, the question is, I wonder if these are projects that could ever work on a large scale.
Yes,
are you gonna scale it up, then, Danny? When are you gonna scale it up? When are we gonna get like a Climavore meals in the supermarket?
Yeah, it's interesting because in a lot of in the research technology kind of innovation world, there's always this thing that scaling up is good and replicability is also good, but sometimes might not. And also we think a lot about it, like how much do we replicate what we're doing, or do we need to scale up at all. Especially, if you look at degrowth, critical economies and theories, like, do we need to, is it good to scale up? Or maybe we need to find other things that is reinventing methodologies, but not just copy pasting and making it bigger. Because many of the problems of extractivism are precisely coming from that. So far, the way we think about it is maybe these methodologies that perhaps can be replicated and maybe scaled up to a certain degree, but maybe not necessarily the different prototypes we are testing out. But yeah, we don't have a yes or no answer to this. Is something that we think a lot about it.
Yeah. Also, I think with this question, I think there are, I think, the two fallacies involved in this question. One of the things that I think is a common myth is the notion that we are fed by the scaled up industrial practices, but for the majority of the world, they are fed by small scale farming. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of the world, something like 70% of all proteins that we get as a global human species, 70% comes from small scale farming, and 25% comes from the scaled, industrial practices. But also, like, what is fascinating is that small percentage, that 20 to 25% of scaled farming, is also using up the vast majority of all the resources. Like it's like small scale farmers are not the reason why we have this climate problem, while the large scale farmers who take up so much water, take up so much land, and also these monocultures are the ones who are creating the biggest impact. So scale is really fascinating on how we've come to believe that scaled agricultural industrial practices is what's keeping us fed, while it's not what's keeping us fed, really. Mm-hmm. So maybe we should maybe there's no reason to scale it. Maybe there's no, other than perhaps somebody being able, one specific person or company being able to make a lot of money out of it. That's really, I think, the concern. Like, scale is about how do we make sure that one company or one person can make as much money as possible, not how do we make sure that people are fed.
That's a good point. Yeah.
But that's just, I find it a fascinating question, because I think a lot of young young farmers, young people thinking about policy, are often challenged to figure out ways to scale things, while scaling maybe is what's gotten us in these problems.
Yes.
Another question we have is, why look for museums if the museum would be the project itself, and invite people to join the project in the nature instead of go and visit the museum? Mm-hmm. Does that, I think,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, it's also a good question. I think for us, we try to avoid these binaries of like either in or out. I think like both worlds, like cultural institutions have a point and an agency, not to be underestimated. And then, of course, like doing things outdoors also has a different agency in terms of relationships and experiences. In our case, or in our practice, what we try to do is a bit of both, because we like to see some of these projects also as active devices in a way, or devices that can be activated by conversations, by actually having non-human residents in them, and that is very challenging to do within like 4 walls and a roof. But on the other hand, also with the whole Becoming Climavore project, it was quite powerful when Tate removed salmon and made these press release, and it was in the Guardian and big newspapers. It was a big thing, and that mediatic impact of like other museums saying like, oh wow, like Tate has removed salmon, maybe us also we need to remove it, or maybe we need to start questioning what we have on the menu. So fine, it might be problematic for some people to a certain degree, but at the same time, the agency that these institutions play in civic life is quite considerable. And yeah, we like to engage with that layer as well as part of the work we do, because the outreach is, again, talking about scaling up. If we want to scale up the outreach of what we do, museums have certainly the power to do that.
One of the things that I noted down, like really, like I note things down to concentrate, to pay attention while you were talking, was this notion. I thought was extremely poetic. I perhaps cannot replicate how you said it exactly, but how people, communities, and the seeds themselves had developed resistance to drought, right? I think that is so fascinating and such a beautiful way to sort of remind us, perhaps, that yes, what we're heading towards is unprecedented climate disruption and an unprecedented, sort of extinction event. Yet life has a history and has an ability to adapt. And people can be part of that. Communities can be part of that. And communities have been part of it. They have developed technologies and techniques and to emancipate themselves from mafiosi, but also to adapt to climate change. One thing though that struck me when I was got really enjoying this thing that resonated, I was struck by how in recent reporting by the IPCC, they're talking about how adaptation and mitigation, they dedicate a whole report on that, but they basically are telling us that countries with money will be able to adapt to the climate change, and those with no money will not be able to adapt. And so like the destruction and the impact will be much heavier on countries that that are poorer, like, and I am sort of, I heard you say that and I got really excited, and then I was reminded by this idea. I'm like, now I don't know where I am at. Like, do we believe and sort of trust and hold optimism to the resilience of people and communities and life? Or should we be alarmed because perhaps, like you said, who can afford to eat seasonally, but also who can afford to adapt? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. And yeah, we like to be optimistic and hope for the best, but at the same time, yeah, work hard to tackle like these very structural problems that are part of the places where we live, as in here where I am now. And yeah, but we need to have hope, I think.
I am anyways like given hope by the work you've done, bringing in so many local and multidisciplinary scientific expertise, but also of sort of people living together. That gives me hope. And the fact that you're able to have negotiations with restaurants, museum, makes me wonder like how much, like makes me think that perhaps we can negotiate with our supermarkets to stop, what did you say? What did you call it? To have like poisonous products?
Well, yeah, there are products that are poisoning us. Yeah, and maybe it follows health and safety regulations, but like those regulations could be a bit better to actually improve our health and not just do the minimum harm.
Yeah. So yeah, I think my takeaway is
with antibiotic resistance, like there's like a lot of studies like how much antibiotic resistance is shifting because of everything that is fed to kind of industrial animal production.
Yeah.
And so on and so on. Yeah.
I'm gonna sort of take away with me that we do need these different sort of very embedded, very slow and very communal learning approaches to do things different. I'm a little bit scared by these seasons of wetlands, seasons of drought, seasons of moving deserts. What was the last? Seasons of dead zones. This is quite It is a bit scary. This is scary. Do you experience fear when you're looking into this, when you're studying this, when you're synthesizing and analyzing and coming up with this vision of the future? Do you feel fear, or what is happening? Because it scares me.
I'm scared when I read the news. I think the news are much more scary.
Yeah.
No, again, it's like for us, it's like how to envision other possible futures and create this fora to discuss them.
Yeah. Do you think that these seasons are going to be all like? Do you see like how in some like are they geographically? Because we're used to seasons sort of as something that happens everywhere, but like, do you feel like in what you've researched, are there particular places, like for example, Western Europe or Central Europe or Eastern Europe, where we might see certain seasons for a long time, or?
That's hard to tell. I think for us, the way we formulate these seasons is based on a particular case study, like in the case of Sicily. And then there we can talk about that season that might apply to other places or not. But it's something to think about.
Yeah. I'm excited for this future of mostly people coming together and learning together and coming up with adaptive eating. I want to thank you. We are a little bit over time. I want to thank you so much for your time, for your vision, and for your patience with us. I also want to thank the audience who has been with us this whole year. We unfortunately, this is our last lecture, our very last lecture this year. Because the next lecture next week on the 25th of April, for those of you who already have a ticket, we had to cancel it due to unforeseen circumstances. I want to thank you all for really being with us this whole year and learning with us, especially the students who now have an exam to prepare for, which is the fun part of this course for me. No. And for all the people that have come and thought with us and felt with us and shared with us, I want to thank you all. I specifically want to thank Helena Verheijen, Susanne Kleerding, and Silke Gierings, who are part of the Studium team. I am leaving after this year. This is my last year as coordinator of Studium Generale Gent, and I am extremely grateful for having worked with the three of you this year. It was really a lot of fun, and I hope you all have a great, continue working together and have a great time and a very caring time like you did for me. Thank you all very much. Have a nice evening, everyone. And thank you, Danny.